Welcome back to the discussion of spatial query languages. In the last two videos, we briefly talked about the notion of queries, the notion of query languages, and we also started looking at SQL, particularly facilities and statements to create tables and to populate them. Okay. Today, the focus is to look at the actual querying part of SQL, which is primarily the select statement. Now, a select statement is fairly sophisticated. It has many facilities, and you can do a lot with select statement. So, thus we are going to decompose the discussion into a couple of pieces. Okay. So, first we will simply look at the easiest part of select, working with single tables. So, at the completion of this module, we should all be comfortable looking at a single table SQL statement, a single block without nesting, and understand its output. The second objective would be to compose simple single block select statement to retrieve data from one table. Okay. So, before we do that, let us look at the big picture of select statement. It is part of the data manipulation language subcomponent of SQL. In contrast to data definition, that is where the create table and alter table resided. Inside data manipulation, you have select statement as well as insert that we saw in the last module, update as well as delete. Okay. For a select statement, the main purpose is to retrieve data from one table or a set of tables. Okay. And the result of select also is a table. So, it is essentially a part of relational algebra. So, select takes one or more table and returns a new table representing the results. It has many features. You can do many things with it. The first thing to be aware of is that select statement has about half a dozen clauses, and we will start with the simplest one first and move forward. In addition to this, it can also make use of many operators and functions, and we will show you some examples very soon. So, you can do arithmetic, string manipulation, statistics and things of that kind with select. And finally, it can also do nesting. So, if you have seen programs in Java or Python where you nest loops or you define one method or function inside the other, there is a similar nesting facility available with select. And again, if you have done nested loops and so on, it may feel very natural to you, but if you are beginning and you haven't seen those before, it is best to postpone the discussion of nested and first get used to the simple single block form. Now, our discussion of select statement is going to be somewhat limited because our real goal is to understand spatial querying part. So, essentially look at spatial operators and functions and data type, but in order to appreciate the full power, we want to learn at least some common uses of select in order to do single table query, multi-table query, and then we will use those with spatial aspects. Okay. And in terms of our learning, it will be primarily based on examples. So, in some sense you can think of it as design patterns. So, I will show you some common queries and common things people do with select statements. Okay. And main goal would be to read and compose these select statements, and again idea would be to look at very common use cases. So, we will show you the clauses such as select, from, where, and we will show you the operators as well. Okay. All right, so looking at the clauses, okay, there are about half a dozen clauses. There are two which are mandatory. So, in order for you to have any query that the database can understand, you need at least two clauses. The first clause has same name as the overall statement, and it is called the select clause, and it usually specifies the format of the result. So, in the result, if you want two columns, then those two have to be listed in the select clause. Okay. The next clause is from. And in the from clause, we list the tables. So, if let us say the data comes from country table or the city table, and then you want to take a subset of data from those tables, then country and city table may be listed in from clause. Okay. So, in any select statement that database can understand, these two clauses must be present. Okay. In addition, there are many optional clauses. Okay. First of which is where, and using where you can specify a subset of rows. So, let us say we are querying data in the country table, and we are only interested in countries with large population, maybe population above 100 million. Then that is the condition which we will specify in where. Okay. You can also think of subsetting the columns. So let's say country table had half a dozen columns and we want only 2 columns, then those columns could be listed in select one. So between select and where, you could specify subsets of columns and subsets of rows. Okay. The next set of columns have to, in some sense, further process the result. So there is order by column, which sorts your result. So let's say when we get these list of countries with populations above 100 million, and we want the result sorted alphabetically by country name, then that can be specified by order by clause. Okay. And finally, we have a pair of clauses, group by and having, using which we can do small simple statistics. So for example, you may want to ask for the average population for the group of countries where the population is at least 100 million. And in that case, we can use group by or having to compute the statistics such as average, sum, minimum, maximum, and so on. Okay. So this gives us a big picture of select statement clauses. Another part of select statement is the richness of operators and the richness of functions. So at least we can give you a feel for what type of operators you are likely to see. And many of these are very familiar. If you have done programming in any language, Perl, Python, Java, you're going to see these operators. For example, arithmetic. So if you had numeric columns, you can add, subtract, multiply, and so on. Okay. There are comparison operators. So when we wanted countries with population greater than 100 million, then we look at the column population, and we may have to compare it with 100 million using operators like less than, greater than, and those are all supported. In addition to the conventional comparison like equal to, greater than, less than, select statement also has a few more which are in some sense shortcuts, such as between. So when you look at this between, it is a shortcut for a combination of 2 conditions. So let's say we say population between 100 million and 500 million, then that's a shortcut for saying population greater than 100 million and population less than 500 million. Okay. And then you have operators for string matching, which is like this operator called like, that allows you to do exact string matching. So you may want to ask for all the countries whose name begin with the letter A or end with letter A, and those kind of string matching is provided in the like. Okay. There are other operators. So if you are interested in forming more complex conditions, you can use the logical conjunction, disjunction, and so on. And these are again very similar to what you may see in other languages. In SQL, they are given their English names like and, or, not, and so on. So let's say we wanted to list all countries which qualify 2 conditions. Number 1, their populations are above 100 million. And second, maybe we want to say the continent is Asia. Then you could specify those 2 simple conditions and compose them together with and. Okay. Other families of operators include statistics. So basic SQL has about half a dozen simple statistical operations. So for a group of countries, you could compute min, minimum, maximum, average, sum, etc. Okay. There are other statistical packages within SQL, but they tend to be vendor specific. So you can also do other common statistics in here. Okay. And then finally, if you are familiar with set algebra, then we can take 2 different select statements and combine them using set operations such as union or intersection. You can even put some conditions on the set. So you could look at if a particular value is a member of the set and so on. Great. So this gives you a beginning of what is in SQL. There are other unique things in SQL. There are other data types such as currency, date, and so on. And with SQL 3, in fact, there are user-defined data types. So you can even add spatial data types such as points, polygons, and later part of this chapter we are going to see those. Okay. Great. So with this, let's start looking at the actual query. We saw the big picture, what select can do, but let's try to go do something simple with it, and we'll slightly build on that simple examples to strengthen our skill. So let's start with the hello world example in select. Okay. The most simple thing you can do with select statement. And in that case, we are only going to use 2 clauses, the select and the from. And our capability would be to essentially list a subset of columns. Okay. We won't be able to do subset of rows using these 2 clauses, but we could certainly ask for subset of columns. Okay. So let's recall this city table. We saw that in the last module, and for every city we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns, right? We have name, country, population, capital, and also the geometric footprint that's called shape here. Okay. So suppose we want a subset of columns such as specified by this English query, where we are saying list the cities with their countries. So we want the name of the city and the country. Okay. So in order to specify that, we could list those two columns in the select clause, and then the result will give us just these two columns. Okay. So the result may be name and country. Okay. So this is the input and output, and in order to specify this, we will have a very simple select statement with two clauses. In the from clause, we list the table. So we are saying let's look at the table city. It may have many columns, but in the result we only want two columns. We want name and country. Okay. So with this very small query, you are going to extract two columns from this table, and the result may look like this. Okay. So this is I'm going to assume that this is simple enough for us to understand. I'm not going to give an execution or interpretation algorithm for now, but let's rely on your intuition, and we'll build on that for a while. Maybe in the next video, we will come back and talk formally about how to interpret these operators. Okay. Good. So once we are done with this hello world, let's try to get a little more ambitious and try to do some more things. Okay. So the hello world with select and from clause, we could pick a subset of columns. Okay. So natural next question may be, how do you pick subset of rows? And this is where the next clause comes in the play. It's called the where clause. Okay. So now we are going to have a select statement with three clauses. So here let's say English query is the following. We want names of cities from the city table, but now there is a condition, and you may want to see where the condition is, and it shows up here. So we don't want all the cities. We only want cities which are capital. So if we go back to last slide and see the city table, you notice there is a column, a Boolean column called capital, right? Some cities the value is yes, saying they are capital, like Havana is capital of Cuba, but other cities, the value is no. Toronto is not a capital of Canada, right? So we only want the cities where this capital is yes. Okay? So in order to extract those, we will use the where clause, and in the where clause you can put a condition on that particular column called capital. Okay? So our result may look like this. Here we are extracting a subset of rows, and notice that the condition says the capital column is always yes. Okay? So to specify this, your SQL query may look like this. So again we are saying work with the table named city, and in this table only select rows which satisfy this condition, capital equal to yes. Okay? Now what about the columns? How many columns do we want? And in this case we actually wanted to select all columns. And here is a shorthand. You could choose to list all the columns if you like, or a shorthand is star, which says all the columns. And you might actually recall a similar expression in Unix shell scripting languages, where star matches all the files in a directory. Some of the regular expressions use star in a different way, but it's sort of coming from Unix. Okay? So here is another very simple query which shows you now three clauses. Okay? The from clause lists a table. The select simply says get me all the columns, leave them as it is, and the where is saying give me a subset of rows. Okay, great. So we'll show you one more example of where, and in this case we are using aliasing. So sometimes the table names are long, and that's good for documentation and for broad audience. But if you are writing it again and again in a query, some of us may find it tedious to type. So either you can lean on your editor to complete the table names, or you can simply use a short alias. Okay, so here is another query. So let's first look at the query, and then we can come back and talk about alias. Okay, so here is another query with select from where, only three clauses. So notice we are working with the table country at this time. Okay, so we are going to put some conditions on columns inside country table, and we might even subset the columns themselves. So again, look at the where clause. So there is a condition which says CO.life expectancy is less than 70. Okay? So this life expectancy is a column in country table, but instead of saying country.life expectancy, we are saying CO, which is an alias for country, and in the from clause we have specified this new name or short name for country. So we are asking for only those rows where life expectancy is less than 70. And now notice in the select clause, we did not use a star, but instead we listed two specific columns. So in this particular query, we are doing actually two different things. One, show you aliasing in order to reduce the amount of text you have to type in. And second, we also showed you a situation where we are subsetting not only rows but also columns. So it's combining the power of select and where. Okay. Great. So, so this point, one thing to understand is the following. Even though what we showed you so far is very simple, all it did was to subset rows or column, but these represent the most popular forms of select statement. And if you are writing an application program like Java or Python, which goes and fetches data from database, just learning this simple form will give you a lot of power. Okay. So again, try to think about all the use cases. Most of the systems you see on the web, they all have databases behind them, and the type of queries they are sending are simple queries like this. So for example, try to imagine Facebook, right? In case of Facebook, when an individual user logs in, all they see are information about themselves. They may see what's posted on their wall and what's their profile. But in the back, there are big databases which are storing data about all the users. So try to now imagine the query Facebook generates when an individual user like you logs in. It is one of these select queries where the condition is set to say, get me data about this user who just logged in. So you pass the user ID, and then Facebook may choose to retrieve all the data about this user possibly, or a subset of data. Maybe they don't want the entire time history, and they first give you your current snapshot, and so on. So again, a lot of queries that these systems generate are very simple select queries like this. So having learned this itself gives you a lot of power. Okay. But beyond that, you can do more things with these kind of select statements. So let's carry on, and let's continue our journey to look at the other clauses. Okay. So again, try to remember what other clauses are there in select which we haven't seen. Right. Remember, there were half a dozen clauses. So we saw 3. And few we haven't seen. So we are going to see a couple more in this slide. So here we are going to do a little bit of statistics. Maybe even in context of Facebook, people might want to know the number of friends each user has, things of that kind, and that such statistics are very, very powerful and useful. So let's come back to our simple example with country, city, and rivers, and talk about simple statistical query. So here is a first one. And it's asking for average population across capital cities. So remember, in the table there were quite a few cities which were capitals of their country, and they all had different population. But perhaps we just want to do a simple statistics and find the average. Right? So in order to represent that, the simplest way to do statistics is to use these functions such as average, max, or min in the select clause. So this is the simplest way to compute statistics. So when you look at this query, we are using select from where, and in this case you can compute just one statistic, just one summary. Okay. So what does that summary represent here? The group is specified in the where clause in this case. So we are picking up all cities which are capital cities, and then for that group of city we are computing average. Okay. So this is the simplest statistics. It's a one global number. Instead of average, if you put a different function like max or min, you will get the most populated or most populous capital city or least populous capital city, and so on. Okay. So again, this is quite powerful, and this basic statistics itself can take you very far. Okay. But once you go past that, you will notice that many times people actually want to break up this global statistics into finer groups. Okay. And SQL allows you to do that. So this is where the group by clause comes in, and that's the next example. So notice the second query. So here we are still interested in average of a column, gross domestic product, but we don't want one single average across the world. Right? But instead we are forming groups, and the groups here are defined by continents. Okay? So if there are, let's say, about half a dozen continents or so, for each continent we want a separate average. Okay? So these are group statistics. Again, SQL specification is rather simple. The key new part you see here is the group by clause. Okay. So, notice this continent is specified in the group by clause. So, you are saying, well, look at the continent column and every distinct value in that column forms a group. So, all the countries with North America form one group, right, and all the countries with South America forms a separate group. Countries with Europe forms a separate group, Asia another group, and so on. And some groups may have very few countries, and that's fine, right, but those are the groups. And for each group, so start with country table, form these groups by continent, and then for each group, you compute the average, okay, and report the group average with the group ID, right. So, in this output there will be multiple rows, okay, one row per continent, and there will be two columns. So, we will have the name of the continent and the average population. Great. Now, sometimes we may not be interested in all of this group. So, for example, there may be a continent named Antarctica, and as we know it does not have a whole lot of gross domestic product, at least till now. Maybe with climate change it will change, but for now maybe we want to exclude some of those continents from the result, and there is a having clause which allows you to exclude some of those groups. So, we are going to take a slightly different example. So, here we have actually made the queries a little bit more complicated. So, we are saying, okay, the groups are by country, okay. So, each country look at how many rivers originate there. If a country has only one river, we are not interested in that group, but if they have at least two, so if they have 2 or 3 or 4, then you look at those rivers and give me length of the shortest river, okay. So, here again we start with the river table. First we define the groups, and these groups are going to be, the origin, which is the country where these rivers originate. And then we are also saying if the country has only one river or 0 river, then those are excluded from the result. And then finally, we say that if they have multiple rivers, I only want to report a statistic, which is the length of the shortest river. Okay. So, with this we have shown you the richness of select statement, even when you are just working with a single table. Okay. And we have shown you how to use different clauses. We went and we started with select and from, that is the simplest case. But using that you could create a subset of columns. Okay. Then we brought in where clause, which allows you to subset the rows. And then finally we brought in the group by and having clauses, which allows you to do statistics and break that statistics into smaller group and even exclude some group. In the next module, we are going to get a little more ambitious and try to show you how to work with multiple tables. Okay. So, we will wrap up at this point. Do look at them again, do practice with the quiz, or if you have access to SQL with, try some of these out, and then next module will come back and play with multiple tables.